You're on mute, buddy.
Abhivardhan, I think I cannot hear you.
Abhivardhan, you are on mute, I guess.
No
Okay.
issues. No problem. Anyways, so again, good evening to everyone. This is Abhivardhan. I'm sorry that I was mute. And we are here for the episode 4 of Interesting, season 1. After a long break, we are back. And I have some amazing people with me for this discussion from the Indian Twitterati. We have our friends Akshay and Kiran again. And we have Pratyasha and Abhishek also in this discussion. Now, the context of this discussion is based on the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in India. And the reason why we thought to take this discussion was because there are many nuances with respect to various policy failures at various levels. And often what happens is that, like any other policy failure or any other crisis, sometimes we leave the nuances and we do not discuss the real issues that come into being, and more or less it goes into rhetoric. So the purpose of this episode is to ensure that we come up with a good discourse. We discuss things which are related to the second wave, how our institutions have handled it, from the media to the governments to the courts to whatnot, and how this trajectory has been going through. Now, Pratyasha would be covering the policy aspects of this issue, Abhishek would be covering the legal aspects of this issue, and Akshay would be covering the economic aspects of this issue, how the Indian economy has been affected, or I would say how on certain aspects of logistic aspects and so forth, the trajectory has gone through. So without wasting time, let me give a slight background of the discussion. I don't need to typically introduce anyone to the problem that we are facing in India. In fact, it's a crisis, the second wave crisis. And if we remember, the second wave in India typically kind of bloated up in the second week of April amidst the election rallies and the situation in Kumbh Mela, particularly in Haridwar. And from there, everything just shot up and the COVID situation became worse and worse and worse. Now, we are expecting hopefully that maybe the peak is going to come, or maybe the cases would go down. But again, there are many questions which we may ask. Like, for example, we can ask, okay, whether the system has collapsed, the healthcare system itself has collapsed or not, whether separation of powers has been respected or not, whether the issue that the issue of federalism, cooperation between state and central governments, whether that has been good or not. So these are questions which must be asked, but in a more dispassionate, in a more I would say generic way, which is reasonable enough, and people understand out of panic and anything that goes on what actually the real issues are. So to be fair enough, this is more like a discussion, and we are not asserting ourselves as experts anyways. We just believe that we are trying to share our views. So yep, here we begin with the fourth episode. So as we know that the second wave has gone and there are various problems which have emerged, the first issue that I would like to cover up in this episode is vaccine hesitancy. Now, we must be proud of the fact that two great companies in India developed the vaccines who actually have their own aspects of efficacy. And many people have started taking it, but still the many is not the most. And again, as far as the population aspects are concerned, I don't think so we are going to reach it so fast. But again, that is based on the kind of numbers of production capacity and all those aspects. So it is a very relatable issue. But vaccine hesitancy is something which is not just about how governments are procuring vaccine always. It's also connected to the way it is sold to the people, because the issue of perception comes into being. For example, vaccine hesitancy became kind of a norm for perception making for the media, whether national, whether local, whether regional, whether international. And that became because maybe it is profiteering. It actually helps people in that way when it comes to the media. But I think this has also exposed many fault lines when it comes to, I would say, the whole framework of understanding how information flows and how we understand it. Because I think similar, I'm not saying that vaccine hesitancy could have happened in America like that, but again, that's a different case altogether. But again, they also suffered similar information crisis, and they have been suffering since. So we also are suffering the same information warfare or some information crisis. So I'd like to ask Pratyasha to shed some light about how this has emerged and what is your view on this, and then maybe we can have follow-ups. And I will keep it open to everyone. Anybody can have follow-ups. We can add some valuable points to it, and let's begin.
Thank you, Abhivardhan, and it's great to see a lot of people who I regularly communicate with on Twitter, seeing them face to face within this lockdown period. It's really nice. It's a great topic to begin with, vaccine hesitancy. It's particularly important now because we have reached a phase in the larger discourse where the argument has moved more towards, don't really talk too much about hesitancy because now it's a supply issue. So you're really barking up the wrong tree, and hesitancy is something that might be like a hot take on social media, but in reality, it's actually the supply crunch which needs to be talked about. So keep it aside. So that sort of aggravates the situation, considering the base where we are starting from, and the base is basically that there is no concerted communication around vaccine hesitancy of any kind. Vaccine hesitancy, like you mentioned, Abhivardhan, it's not just something that's there in India. In fact, if we start to think of it behaviorally, all sorts of preventive behaviors, whether it's wearing a seat belt, whether it's wearing a condom, whether it's getting a HIV test, a cervical cancer test, a breast examination, and I'm giving you health examples because that's the field I work in. Um, all of these preventive behaviors are largely negotiations between the kind of risk we see in not undertaking this preventive behavior and the kind of immediate loss or gain that we see as a result of undertaking this particular behavior. So it was very clear from the beginning that something as significant as putting something in your body to prevent a disease that may or may not be salient to you, that may or may not be happening right next to you, is going to be a significant barrier. What added to that barrier, and particularly for India, is the fact that unlike in the US, where there is a lot of data around how people react to vaccines, particularly how adults react to vaccines, there isn't any such like huge corpus of data, either quantitative or qualitative, that we can draw from in India, primarily because we don't have that kind of an institutional push for any kind of adult vaccine. The largest or the most systematic adult vaccination that I can think of is probably the antenatal care vaccines given to pregnant women. But that's also a very it's a subset of the larger population, and it's a very specific context of pregnancy. And within that, people can think and process it differently when a child's involved. So largely, when we are starting to think of a universal vaccination with a population whose last experience of vaccination must have been decades back, when their children must have got some kind of immunization shot, it's very callous and slightly responsible to anchor any kind of conversation on hesitancy just to the fear perception of people, that there is so much communication, that there's so much palpable fear all around us, so people must be scared. They are just waiting for vaccines. The minute we give them a vaccine, they are going to take it. So I think that's what's largely happened in India, that we've anchored to that fear perception of people, and we've sort of said that they are just waiting for vaccines. The minute we make it accessible to them, they are going to take it. But as we see, that's largely not happening. The second major issue with why this situation was supposed to be different is that, unlike other vaccines, like say whatever children take in our large immunization schedule or polio vaccines, the entire process of the creation and rollout of the COVID vaccine has played out viscerally in front of the public. So we have seen discussions, we've heard discussions on WhatsApp, we've seen forwards about who's manufacturing, how is it being manufactured, how many people died during the testing, this, that. Whether it's wrong or right information is very different, but we are operating in a situation of extreme information overload. And this was not the case earlier. In fact, wherever this has been the case earlier, and there are a few studies, like say, I think it was for the SARS study, which had happened somewhere in Karnataka, which was a new vaccine. There were similar kinds of fears in people. But considering the large amount of information overload that we were operating under, cognitively, it's that much more pressure on people to sort of decide whether I need to go there or not. And then what happened is, since October last year, when the cases started to go down and the saliency decreased, and we saw everything open up, larger crowds, the political class, the common, man and woman being absolutely up and about, that fear perception that people were latching on to, at least like from the administration side, did not really matter. And hence we saw a large amount of hesitancy not being expressed, probably not being articulated, but when we are looking at the numbers, particularly for the above 45 numbers, it came across very, very significantly. Along with that, I think what happened, and which was very, very crucial, is the kind of discourse that we had around vaccines, particularly during the early part of the year when it was being rolled out for the frontline workers. And this came through when Covaxin was actually approved for emergency use. This was a very, people won't admit it because it was camouflaged in very sciencey language, but that's a very obtuse stand that if you're trying to camouflage it in some sciencey language, it won't percolate down. What's happened is it has actually percolated down. So if we talk to our parents or if we talk to senior citizens, we can understand that they are getting absolutely the same information packaged in some additional stuff, which we don't need to talk about. So we saw what happened with Covaxin. It was called, the BJP vaccine by some political parties and leaders. We heard about the entire discussion that happened around the efficacy of Covaxin and how it was used as a stick to particularly beat this government with. And most importantly, I think one of the things which is forgotten now is during December and January, there was this entire conversation around how the government is actually going to treat us to a substandard vaccine just because they want to play the nationalism card. And I remember it distinctly, where it was being said that you don't want us to get good vaccines like Pfizer or Moderna. You want to show that this is Atmanirbhar Bharat, and you want to show that you are doing something for much cheaper, and hence you're okay with giving Indians a substandard vaccine. And that sort of, that stamp of it being substandard, not efficacious, sort of filtered down, and it was absolutely validated by the political class, sometimes in sophisticated language and sometimes in absolutely crass language, but it was a dog whistle to particular groups who are already showing some kind of hesitancy to say that you stay away from it. In fact, it was so significant that in Chhattisgarh, the rollout of Covaxin itself, while it was in cold storage, was delayed for about, I think, half a month or so, 15 days or so. So, these are some of the things that have contributed to vaccine hesitancy, and that's something we continue seeing till now. How can we sort of resolve it? How can we go ahead with it? There are multiple things. First of all, identify the drivers which are leading to vaccine hesitancy, and these may not be the same everywhere. So there are common things like fear of adverse effects, which we know about. So we know, like, maybe one person who has suffered from some kind of a situation 2 days after taking the vaccine, but because we anchor to that particular date, that's how information is given to us. We try to link it back to the vaccine and say that, oh, we could potentially die or get a blood clot, because that's the availability heuristic that plays up. The other significant fact which comes up here, and it's very, very important, particularly considering certain geographies now, like Punjab, is the aspect of trust on authority. And that trust on authority is not just political authority, but it's also medical authority. Now, we are in a situation where we don't want, and to a large extent quite true, we don't want to speak a word about, doctors in the wrong way, but that's not the perception with which a large number of, like a huge amount of population in this country operate. the form system till now is extremely alienated from the larger population. It is there is an emotional distance associated with the government healthcare, and there is a trust deficit happening. So in a large number of cases, like in Punjab, because it is this government which is pushing this vaccine, it is considered to be a hoax, because the entire corona virus like scare for them is supposed to be a ploy by the government to actually remove them from Delhi and take away focus from the farmer protest. So that's the kind of context in which they are operating, while in other places it's more about, if I go to the hospital, what do they do with me? What do they put in me? Is this going to make me infertile? Is this going to make me lose my baby? So we have like a huge trust deficit with the government healthcare system also, and this kind of anti-central party sentiment that has been embedded, and in some cases maybe very inherent also. So these are like, I mean, there's a lot to talk about it, but I'll stop here. There are some significant drivers, and the government needs to first understand these drivers and then come up with a large scale campaign around hesitancy. And by campaign, I don't mean like a larger sort of BCC campaign or something like that. That's not the idea, but at least to acknowledge it in a very systematic, in a very coherent way, and try to take in the different segments who are dealing with hesitancy in different ways. Because when we think of hesitancy, we are largely thinking of the anti-vax US kind of crowd who will go against like large pharma and say, I'll never like vaccinate. That's not the kind of situation we have in India. We have the wait and watch crowd. We have the trade-off crowd. Should I do it now or should I do it later? Should I have Covishield or Covaxin? Should I wait for a foreign vaccine? So these are the kinds of hesitancy parameters that we are seeing. And once we identify that, acknowledge that, and have a very concerted campaign around it, we can start dealing with it. And it's high time now, because in a couple of months, we'll reach the peak of voluntary vaccinations being done. Whoever wants to go on their own will have gotten it by then. And after that, getting to that peak would become very difficult. So whatever time is lost. But from now onwards, the government needs to get extremely serious about it.
Great. So if anybody wishes to add something, they can go ahead. So if Akshay wishes to, or Abhishek wishes to, he can.
I just have a question actually. Sorry, go ahead, Kiran.
No, Akshay, you can go. I will ask. I will follow up afterwards.
Yeah, just my question to Pratyasha, kind of double clicking on this whole issue of government system and politicians, right? And to some extent, I would say media as well. Firstly, I mean, before I get into that question itself, just to stipulate, yes, there is a supply is the bigger issue now. Supply has to be solved, etc., etc. But if you have to get to the full coverage of 900 million adults, then you will have to solve the demand issue, which is also the hesitancy issue over the next few months for sure, right? In fact, it should have been done yesterday. I mean, but better late than never. It has to be done at least now. Having said that, now coming to these specific influencing mechanisms for why hesitancy could have come about, or at least become a bigger factor. I mean, largely, at least, I mean, the way I look at it is that other than the last aspect, which is the government system itself, and having questions about that, if you take politicians and if you take media, any noise made by them, does it really have that much of an effect on the ground? That's my first question. And second, is that only the case because there hasn't been a communication or a concerted campaign by the government? And had there been like kind of a very like high voltage campaign like you saw with, let's say, Swachh Bharat or Beti Bachao or any of those things, right? Like really public campaigns which are owned by the politicians, including all influencers, you know, whether it is celebrities, religious leaders, everybody. And it is just the absence of that which kind of like made it possible, even if the answer to question one is yes, it does have an influence on the ground. Isn't it just the vacuum which has allowed this to kind of like percolate to the ground in the first place? In other words, if we were to actually like do such a concerted campaign, would it really matter? Because how much of an influence does a section of the media or a section of politicians, you know, offhand comments, how much of an effect does it really have on an ordinary person on the ground?
So, Akshay, there are studies around vaccine hesitancy across the world which actually do state what you mentioned, that politicians may not be the primary influencers when it comes to either hesitancy or even vaccine acceptance. So even earlier, when during Covaxin, that entire crisis, we were hearing about why does Modi not take Covaxin right now? Like, why isn't he taking the first shot and showing us that Covaxin is safe? And that was like a very stupid argument, because people rarely anchor to politicians' behaviors when thinking of these actions. It's more of the medical fraternity, it's more of the authority figure in that discipline who they anchor to. But my concern was, at least in some cases, particularly in UP, where there has been like a history of vaccine hesitancy in certain communities, the minute you politicize the vaccine and you'd say that, this, if we take this, then it is almost playing into the hands of BJP. That sort of argument, I don't think it was meant to be just an offhand comment to be put out on social media and left at that. There was certainly some repercussion of it going into the community, because it was meant to play into the sentiments of people who already have this kind of an hesitancy, and certain political leaders were adding to it. But to your point, yes, I think more of the barriers are internal barriers, and it may not have come from this misinformation campaign happening. So the very idea that there is a vaccine rollout happening, and what this vaccine is supposed to do, so one of the big confusions was, why should I take a vaccine if I am still going to be infected? It's a very basic difference between prevention and protection. So this is not going to prevent me from getting infected, but it's probably going to protect me from being hospitalized or being in a critical care unit or dying. This essential communication also was not done. So to a large extent, we heard a lot of communication around, if we are anyway going to be infected, why do I go to a center and risk getting infected and then deal with the adverse effect of the vaccine? So a lot of these very strong mental models which operate when there is any kind of preventive care will be ultimately the ones which make you which make you take that decision. So you might have be like, in behavioral science, we use a very common example. You might research for 6 months about buying a car, but when you go to the showroom, you look at the color of the car and buy it. So it's the basic mental models which you have, which operate at the point of decision making, which will be very critical. And somehow I feel that there has either not been a huge attempt to study it, there has been some kind of underestimation of how important these behavioral barriers could be, and at the same time it has been aided by this like huge amount of misinformation and this vacuum of any kind of correction happening, which could have had quite sinister effects. Of course, because we don't have any kind of data around that, I can only assume. But hopefully we start seeing more studies, because this is going to continue for at least one more year, and it will be important to track what are these. In the future we might have booster shots, we might have something else. So it's good to collect that data now and understand what those behavioral barriers were.
I would like to ask a question on the media. Basically, there is I remember following the media around February and March when the vaccines were being rolled out, and there were reports of people dying after the vaccine. It was not just having an adverse effect. Actually, I think there were prominent news, at least in Telugu, I read some news, and in English as well, in other Indian languages probably as well. And personal experience, like when I was talking to my family and relatives, they were mentioning these news reports. And it was obviously many hundreds of thousands of people got vaccinated, and maybe there would be somebody getting an adverse effect, but that adverse effect and death were being reported in the news. And it seems like there was no follow-up from the government or concerned medical authorities that at least to kind of balance this narrative in the news, um, to show that this is not like poison. This is not like lottery where you some random coin is flipped and somebody would die. This basically, then the problem would be that it's not just about protecting or preventing. It would be like, okay, why should I take the risk of taking this vaccine and potentially dying, even if that probability, people don't really calculate these probabilities. They would just think of like, okay, there is this thing, and instead, if I just avoid doing anything and maybe take preventive measures by staying home or whatever, I would be fine, right? So I cannot tell whether this actually played out to be a significant factor for 45 plus people not getting vaccinated. But I know from my own personal circle, and I know from people I know who got very adverse effects, and actually there were also deaths. And when we look back, and this is really a very sad thing, and everybody in India and people who have loved ones in India have been going through these things. And the question would, at the back of everyone, would be, okay, why could these people not take the vaccine when it was available? There was also like not that much of a crowd in March and early April. Now it is like getting a bit more difficult, obviously. But this moment, what we could have done, not just from the government's point of view, but also civil society point of view, like how we can kind of balance the narrative in the media. So what's your opinion on this? Like, do you think this media reports about deaths of people after getting vaccinated, did they make an effect? Or
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like I can speak from some examples from Odisha, where I'm currently in. So we had like news reports about saying that some person who was vaccinated 2 days back has had like a very like sudden death. That's like the big headline, and somewhere within the subtext is the fact that doctors have said that it has nothing to do with the vaccine. Somewhere in the middle. And when the headline sort of screams at you with like a picture of the syringe and everything, that is sort of the anchor you have, because anyway you're operating in a period of uncertainty. You know that there is a possibility of some people dying, and the more number of cases you see like this, you don't like, that is the availability you have, that's the information you have in front of you, and you sort of anchor to that. This is, I mean, if not malicious, this is absolutely irresponsible reporting from these media houses, and this has happened even before the vaccine had been cleared through trials. So when we were hearing about like vaccines in the test phase, we were hearing about how people in certain like test groups are dying, and they've had this vaccine and then they are dying. And then we were like thinking, is this like in the control group? And in some cases it actually came out that this person who's died is in the control group. That means this person has not even really had the vaccine, but you're saying that because she was in the vaccine study she passed away, and that's the information people take. But I mean, see, the thing is about responsible media reportage and about ethics, I think we can talk till the cows come home. I don't know what we can really do about it. But what can the government do about it? I think currently it's extremely important for the government to immediately release the data around the number of adverse events and the number of reinfections and even probable deaths which have happened after single and double dosage of the vaccines. Because in that situation of information vacuum, any such reporting will be what people will anchor to. So unless we have that clarity, and it's very easy for the government to do that. So the US has done that to a significant extent, where they have been transparent with the number of reinfections which has happened. So maybe I think we need to periodically keep releasing that data and telling people that yes, reinfections might happen, but this is like the population. And then it's up to the civil society, it's up to the state governments, district administration to sort of distill that information, simplify it, and take it through frontline workers to the community. But when it comes to like reporting, I hope the media realizes that a continuous barrage of such kind of articles, and people do read it, and even now if they don't read it, I'm a firm believer that every news out there is ultimately making its way to my parents' WhatsApp. Like that's what I firmly believe in some way or the other. So you cannot just say that it was somewhere in the subtext and I missed that. But it's for them to introspect and see, I mean, whether they are fulfilling their responsibility well or not. But for us, I think we can push the government to clear the air around that so that such mischief can be nipped at the bud going ahead.
I'll just chip in with two things. Firstly, Uttar Pradesh, as Pratyasha rightly mentioned. Recently, you'll remember that there were deaths in Gorakhpur related to Japanese encephalitis. After that, the government of UP started a massive vaccination program to vaccinate all the susceptible children, especially in the eastern UP, Purvanchal, which is the epicenter. You won't believe, I come from that area, you won't believe the amount of disinformation which was spread through political parties and means to stop that, so that the deaths remain static, the number of deaths remain constant for years to come, and the deaths actually happen. Children actually go to hospitals. The government did not give up. They actually had the largest vaccination program. They went with the shots, they went with the boosters, they forced people. They tried to blackmail people unofficially, of course. I can't say it like officially they blackmailed, but the all the Anganwadi centers, all the incentives they used to get, the midday meal, a lot of things, the school dresses, everything was linked to it unofficially, and therefore now we have very less deaths. Most of the deaths that happen in Gorakhpur because of Japanese encephalitis are children who are coming from Bihar. UP has actually stopped it. So if a government wants to vaccinate you, they will find a way to do it. Secondly, on the issue of government's responsibility of this misinformation, I think it has created this problem. There has been a confused messaging from the initial stages. It has conceded the space to all these agents of chaos who have actually gone ahead and did this. As Pratisha rightly mentioned, we are, I don't know why the government believes that we are not ready for data, or we are not ready for truth, or we can't handle the data, or we can't handle the truth. What is the problem? I don't understand. Why can't they release the data? Why can't they come clean on everything? Take example of vaccines. I don't even know how many quantities are coming to UP, to which city every day. I have to find out from the CMO office. They just release one fortnightly that okay, in next 3 days you will get this much data, this much vaccine has been given to every state. I need to know on what basis the allocation is happening as well. Somebody has to explain me this. If you see the affidavit filed in the Supreme Court on the vaccine issue, the supply issue, I think I'm going a little bit astray, but supply issue, the central government still controls the supply of vaccine even if the state government places the order itself. I don't understand how that works. And if that is the vaccine policy, why wasn't it spelled out when the main guidelines came? So there is a huge issue. And on misinformation, it has been a chaos, and the government has done absolutely nothing to address that chaos. I refuse to believe that Modi does not have the power or the capability to come on the screen and actually address all these points with a 5 minute speech. He still has immense goodwill. People might be angry with him right now. A lot of things will happen. A lot of um, political problems may happen, but they still believe if he comes on TV and specifically says that, dekhiye, by July everyone will have vaccine. Do not panic. Please take it manner. 45 ones, second doses. He can come and tell this to government. For instance, when T.S. Dev, I'll give you an example why this government missed. When T.S. Dev, the health minister of Chhattisgarh, refused to allow Covaxin, the government has the power and the DMA to force him to administer Covaxin. The central government did not act proactively. They let all these things happen because I think they wanted to make political benefit out of it. I don't know what they were actually thinking. There might be some legitimate reasons, but the problem is I don't know what those reasons are. And that is my problem. How do we counter something when we don't have enough data to counter it? So that is my simple problem. The government had to take initiative, they failed, and now we are paying for government's misfeasance in this regard.
Great. Yes, please, Kiran, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a like I look at this problem basically from a European perspective because I live in Europe, and the situation with vaccination has been difficult, like in most parts of the world, especially in Europe. I remember very distinctly, like in March and early April, actually, the vaccination speed in India was actually quicker. So, for example, I was a bit worried whether my European family would be getting vaccinated as quickly as my Indian family. Um, but obviously, things have developed differently afterwards. And a lot of people in India obviously are very annoyed with the government and with the CoWIN app, for example, to get the registration done, right? And we had the same thing. I mean, I was trying to get an appointment several times, and it was not really working. And it was not clear how many vaccines are available. There are certain websites where you can check periodically, getting updated. But you can say that you can do the best. The government can really try to push the information forward and make everything open. But there, in a crisis situation, I think there will always be dissatisfaction because there is not enough information that whatever is the best, it's still like lacking in some sense. So that is one aspect. So we have a definitive gap between what is optimal, what is needed by the civil society, by the general public, and what the government can provide, like reasonably in any reasonable time. The second thing is we are all like reacting in real time to a crisis, and we are always judging like, okay, what is the margin that we have, like how many days, how many weeks before something major happens, and we can kind of plan some measure before that. Like that could be a preventive measure, that could be some kind of treatment, that could be also like logistics, whatever. So there is a margin that everybody is trying to guess, including the public. Like they think, okay, I have time, maybe like a few weeks before I can decide whether I get vaccinated or not. So this margin is really like a very vague, fuzzy thing, and everybody is having it at the back of the head, but it's most likely wrong. And because we are really not in sync with what the real situation is, and the pandemic is evolving very rapidly, right? So what I suspect what happened is that the government expected larger margin to react and somehow have a few more months at its disposal so that things can happen. And obviously it really blew up on the head because they should have done it like with far more seriousness. And this issue, like how do we as a country react to a crisis? And I think Indians, generally we are a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty. I think when we say that the data is not very clear, okay, when there is like some small margin, some doubt, I think there are other countries, they might be a little bit more hesitant and doubtful about such uncertainty. I think we are okay with dealing with uncertainty in our country and with our culture. What I think is really very badly lacking from my point of view is that we don't have actually an efficient method or efficient mechanism to react to crisis. So there is no like standard chain of command where these things at the back of our head, like whatever margin we have, like how many days, what is the decision time for whatever. This is not being passed forwards, and people are just getting confused. And like when the shit hits the fan, like the German expression, everybody is trying to point fingers and place the blame on somebody else, and that doesn't inspire any confidence either, right? So now we have actually a post-crisis situation. The situation is really bad. A lot of people have it very, very bad, and we are trying to kind of pick up the strings and somehow do something. So the issue for me is, okay, how are we going to number one, actually get a better chain of command somehow, where the executive is a little bit more efficient, something that can be done from the center to the states to the district, some way of, if there is a decision that has been taken, something to be implemented. That is one thing. The second thing is the data that they communicate, right, to whatever number of vaccines that are available, number of people that are taking it, number of things that are getting wasted. this type of data, yeah, somehow making it more accessible. Even if I don't know if it is there, if it is accessible, but so yeah, I don't know if anybody has some comments or some ideas like how we can deal with this problem of collapse of the executive actually.
Right. So I think we kind of partially have covered the second section of this discussion, which was regarding government messaging. So what we can do is that on a seminal basis, if we wish to cover some more aspects of government messaging with a few examples, if everybody would like to share, then we can go ahead with that. Or what we can do is that we can jump right away to discuss the international media, because after that we are going to discuss about courts. So it is up to all of you. I think what we can do is that one thing to bring this forward about uh, government messaging, it is very true that the government actually leaves a lot of space and a lot of gaps for people, and whether it's media or the civil society, and then I think there's a sense of disconnect, and this sense of disconnect may be due to any reasons, whether it is omission or commission, whatever. I think that needs to be addressed. So uh, what we can do is either we can go with the international media part. We can pan right into it.
I would like to give a
Yes,
small comment because when we
sure.
are discussing about the government, I would like to just give like a contrast with Germany. So Germany has a very federal system, very comparable to India, and it was actually the same problems with this what we had in India because of the federal system. It was very difficult to implement. For example, lockdown. When should we go to lockdown? You know what things should be left open. So there were rough guidelines that were given from the federal government, and the states, the Bundesländer, have to follow it up and implement it. And that there was no common decision that was taken because of this broad federalism. There was no agreement, and Germany has it a little bit easier, right? There is a more buffer, economic buffer, than India. We cannot just in India shut everything down and expect we survive. We have much less margin, but there was actually a political crisis for some time to get to an agreement. And I think in April, at some point, there was actually at some point Merkel mentioned that yeah, she cannot just leave it everything to the states, and they have to have a central accord. But she didn't do anything for a couple of weeks, delaying everything. And in this time in Germany, there was like a lot of cases, a lot of deaths. This is, it's really a waste of time. But then what happened was the German federal government actually had a law where there were clear guidelines. If this was the number of new cases per 100,000 people in the last 1 week, more than a specific number, then it is obligatory for the states or the districts to lock down. Okay, so there are certain things that have been implemented at the federal level, and there is a legal mechanism for that to kind of put through. And I was waiting, where is that thing in India? It seems like India has been doing it through a very, like a request mechanism where the government says you are encouraged to do that, but the decision is really, up to the states. And we see the disaster that really happened in Maharashtra, right? So the situation in Maharashtra where the second wave was really being nurtured in a long time, and I don't know when it really closed down, probably like in April or something. But there was no standard policy and it was not just not being messaged. It was actually there was a lack in legal mechanism, and I asked what is the sensible thing for us if you want to build such a thing. And apparently in India, in the federal government, I don't know if there is a means actually to do such a thing, or if there is such a means, the federal government just didn't do that. And it was really an abdication of responsibility in my opinion, and it's really sad. I don't know if anybody has some comment on this.
So during the first wave, we did have something similar, but now we have it something similar only for containment zones. So these containment zones are defined into 200-meter areas, 500-meter areas, 1 kilometer areas, which still exist. But for these district-wise guidelines, they were there in the first phase, but in the second phase, they have just left it on the state to decide. I think the states wanted more powers to decide. For instance, I don't know whether for a specific area of Mumbai should be punished because the Maharashtra, the rural Maharashtra is actually under leading a wave. So I think it was rightly given to the states, but the states have made a hash of it, and center has not done anything to own up to the mess. I think if the center comes out with a guideline right now, it would amount to actually taking back control, owning the mess, and nobody wants to own this mess. Everybody wants to just go through this with and then decide later what can we do to redeem ourselves or to save ourselves. Right now, nobody wants to own up the mess. So there is law, there is power with all the governments at every level to go ahead with lockdowns, to go ahead with see such guidelines, formulate such guidelines. But I don't think anyone is willing to do, or I don't think it's even politically feasible to do it right now.
I mean, I was,
And
yeah, Pratisha.
no, I just want. I was just going to say that even in spaces where centralization was imminently possible, and it was absolutely the necessity, which is the vaccine policy. In fact, we saw the government go the opposite way completely and bring in like a disastrous, pretty much decentralization policy based on certain demands of state leaders. So it's not just about avenues not being there. There is very active sort of ceding space to the states to maybe either avoid the brickbats that you might have to face, or to sort of take on like the front end, like the allocation based plaudits, but give the procurement based brickbats for the states to deal with. So I really don't think it's just about lack of avenues. It's a lot about lack of intent as well.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
to kind of build on that, I mean, I see three different types of failures. I mean, when we talk about messaging, I think the messaging failure is reflective of an actual policy and problem-solving failure on the part of government itself, right? So the messaging in some ways is a symptom. And the three big failures that I see is that first is just the lack of data and information itself. Right. And when I say data and information, I'm using that more broadly, also in terms of just how things are being done. So to Abhishek's point earlier, even now amongst the central procurement that's done of vaccines, how that is allocated to different states is not known. How much is allocated is known after the fact, but on what basis and what formula is being used is not known. Right. So one is just a lack of transparency and information, right, which is there. So that is failure number one. Failure number two is just communicating plans ahead of time, right? And what that does is it allows people to weigh in and comment and give information and critique it, which makes for better problem solving. And that wasn't done. So for instance, until yesterday or day before, we didn't have what is the plan to procure vaccines even going forward. We didn't have that at all, right? Only now we know that it is going to be 2 billion vaccines by the end of this year. We didn't have that earlier. So naturally, when you don't have that, and when you don't have any visibility into what is coming up, you have all kinds of criticism, or whether constructive or not, or any kind of problem solving that even society can do, can't happen because you're working in the absence of any kind of plan, which then can be pressure tested and can be critiqued. The secondary consequence of the second failure of not presenting a plan is that then when some things go awry in the plan, right, then the government is reactive.
yeah.
And then any idea that is floating in the discourse, which in the case of vaccines, it was vaccines for all, open it up for everyone who's 18 plus, right? Federalism and free markets, these were the kind of like buzzwords that were there, which actually were not at all aligned with what was the problem statement, which was that you had to ramp up supply, and none of these things would do anything to solve that problem, right? In fact, all of them would serve only to exacerbate that problem.
Exactly.
Right? But it is only because of the first failure, which is lack of data, and the second failure, which is lack of having a policy, which is then announced with a clear plan, which is laid out, that any idea, because then, I mean, everyone is shooting in the dark, right? So everyone is throwing darts, and then the government reactively then is just picking up some of those ideas and saying, okay, now let me just deal with it. And the third big messaging failure, which again is reflective of a deeper policy failure, is just acknowledging and dealing with the crisis when it does hit, right? And that is both, there is a lack of appreciation for the situation, which creates an issue purely, I mean, in terms of like tone deafness and messaging with the people. But it also creates alarm, because if a government is not even seized of the crisis when it has hit, is it actually going to do any kind of crisis management in this first place, right? So I think all those three failures, I think, have come about here: a lack of data and information, a lack of communicating plans ahead of time, leading to reactive policy making, and third is just the right response in a crisis of empathy, of recognizing the situation, and then kind of like outlining how you're going to respond to that crisis. I think all three kind of like failures of messaging and of policy we're seeing in this wave two.
There's one
Yeah,
more
this is
thing.
actually part of this issue is just the stupidity or incapability of the people in the government. Maybe they should have behaved better. So there is actually, rightfully or partially, some blame should be placed with the people in the government. I am actually more worried about a different issue, which is whether our state itself or the institutions of the state itself are just like useless in dealing with the crisis. I mean, if that is the case, then it's not just about this COVID crisis. Let's say we have a second crisis, like something comes up with some other pandemic, right? How are we going to behave differently? Like, we will have exactly the same problems. We will have the federalism. We will have the decomposed politics in different states. We will have the free market versus state control people. We will have massive media disinformation. We will have the courts, not doing their job but poking in unnecessary areas. So everything would just be the same, and how are we going to prevent people from dying? So when this COVID thing started, like last year, before it hit us, I was just briefly looking at the pandemics, what happened in India, and there was this 1918 flu pandemic, right? The Spanish flu. Apparently, it killed 5% of Indians. So it's like a insane thing. We Indians lost the most number of people amongst all the nations in the world. And apparently, like any from the people who got infected, 1 out of 5 died, actually, or something like that. It really horrible. So 5% died, and whoever got infected was very certain that they would be like having an issue. And during that time, obviously, the British Raj was in power, and they didn't care at all, like how to save Indians. And it just proved itself, like the health infrastructure what we have, a big part of it is actually colonial legacy, and it's completely incapable of doing. We don't have the right number of doctors, right number of medical staff, and including the government, the distribution of powers. It seems like there are fundamental weaknesses. So the COVID-2, this SARS-CoV-2 is not as terrible as the Spanish flu, but we lost a lot of people, and we lost a lot of economy. And my question is like, okay, what can we do to kind of make our state institutions a little bit more sensible and stronger? Is it even possible? Because we cannot just keep blaming the people, because that is, people will come, they will go. But if what they have to deal with are just useless institutions, then we are screwed anyway. So I maybe, if anybody has a comment whether we can indeed reform our state institutions somehow to make them more responsive.
One small point to that, particularly with regards to health. Since a long time, there has been a concerted movement to move health to the concurrent list, considering the kind of disparity that we see in the way states are dealing with health. So there is a Kerala with a very robust primary health system versus there's my state, Orissa, along with UP and Bihar, which are absolutely at the bottom of the pyramid. So considering that, I think this was a test case, and this could have been like a very important juncture to push that movement forward and move health to the concurrent list and not leave everything in the hands of the state. Considering the kind of lost faith that we have between the state and the center now, it's probably going to be difficult arriving at a consensus. But what this crisis, and particularly the oxygen shortage crisis in Delhi and some other states, what it has taught us is one of the first things that needs to be done after this is to take a relook at the allocation of responsibilities in the health domain between the state and the center, because that kind of ambiguity which came in resulted in a lot of sort of muck throwing between the two parties. And like on one hand there was the health as a state subject sort of keep throwing it at people when they are trying to say that the center is also to blame, and on the other hand it was about the states actually not being held accountable in a lot of situations, because the courts sort of came in and tried to sort of clamp down on the center, saying that you have to deliver it, which sort of took away that focus from how the states had messed up in a lot of these situations. So I think one of the things moving ahead from this crisis would be to have absolute clarity about addressing that ambiguity between what the state and the central responsibilities, particularly in crisis periods like a pandemic situation, should be. And I think for the civil society and for people working in the space of health policy, the push to move health into the concurrent list should continue, and it should in fact be strengthened, irrespective of the fact that political consensus around it now may be very hard to achieve. But if there is a concerted focus on it, maybe that little bit of institutional strengthening could happen, and the chain of command, Kiran, that you were talking about, maybe we could sort of move towards that.
Yeah, I basically look at it, I'm a computer scientist, so I have sometimes, a peculiar way of looking at problems, which is I look at it as a system, and, can a virus break in, like a computer virus, for example, you kind of pawn the system, just really own the system. So how do you do that? You kind of insert Trojans, you insert certain deficiencies wherever you can break the system. You might know zero-day exploits, like what before the system was purchased by the user, you already insert it inside, or certain things. So you have massive machinery for, let's say, AI machinery or data processing or whatever, so that you can do the number crunching and guess passwords or whatever, and you can break in, right? So essentially, these are the kind of things people do, and our cyber infrastructure is very weak because of these kinds of attacks. They're not inherently robust. Now the thing is, the health or the societal health in a country can also be thought like this. And why not? We can have a biowarfare attack. Like, let's say we have adversaries. They can choose to do an attack, not like necessarily kill everybody. They can also try to like mildly infect us so that our economy gets worse or whatever. So let's say there is a biowarfare attack. How can we as a country react to it? Do we have actually an efficient state mechanism to kind of react to this? If not, what's the point of having an army, is my question. Like, we are not able to react. So it's not like I don't look at it as a political problem. It's really like a national security issue that we need to have at some point health in the concurrent list. And I hope, serious people would really get to that, and maybe the army would also be involved in this, because otherwise it would be a risk. It's a serious risk in the coming years.
I do have a comment, but I think Abhishek wants to say something. I can go after.
No. I have nothing to say. I'll add it to later, but please.
Okay. Yeah, actually, the question that Kiran posed is something that I've also been thinking about over the last few weeks in particular. And I think there are, on the broader issue of state failure and state institutions versus just governance failures, which is with given state capabilities, I mean, governments can do well or do badly and so on, right? So let's keep that aside, because I think I addressed a lot of that in my previous question, lack of planning and all that. And I mean, that's not state capacity issues, that's pure governance failures, right? But on state capacity, I see two issues at a broader level, which I think the Indian state has to get better at dealing with. So one is what I call the uncertainty versus risk issue, and I'll just elaborate on that. And the second thing that I think the Indian state is a little poor at is what you would call the projectizable goals versus more complex problems to solve. And I'll talk of the distinction of both of these. So let's talk about the first one, which is risk versus uncertainty. Broadly speaking, I mean, one thing that I think most people would notice that wave one response of India, whether it was perfect, I mean, it was certainly not perfect, but whatever it was, that wave one response broadly for most people would have been seen as satisfactory. And this is the same state, right? Wave two, obviously much bigger in magnitude, no doubt about it. Having said that, the way wave two response also will be viewed is that it is a failure, right? And I think the fundamental distinction between the two is the uncertainty versus risk distinction, which is when it's an unknown that hits you, which is what wave one was. The Indian state has significant legitimacy to take very bold, coercive actions without being second guessed and with a huge deal of public support. So you can lock down the entire country, have the most stringent lockdown in the world,
Right.
and still for the large part, I mean, it will be seen as a positive move, right? And even if whether it works out or doesn't work out, there will be a lot of latitude given to government saying, yes, we were dealing with an unknown. Nobody knew that COVID would hit us. When it did hit us, I mean, like we had to take some kind of like very bold action. Whatever the government did at that time with the information that they had in hand, let's give them the credit, or let's give them at least a benefit of the doubt on that, right? That's how wave one was. Wave two, on the other hand, is not uncertainty, it's risk. That is, it is a known potential downside, right? That a wave two would happen, that was always a possibility. Magnitude is of course unknown, timing is unknown, but that a wave two would happen shouldn't be like shocking to anyone, right? Given that that's the case, what you need, like with anything where you're managing risk, is to be able to like figure out what are the sets of initiatives that you have to do to be able to de-risk yourself. And that's where I think for the large part, in general, the state in India is not great at figuring out ways to de-risk. And we can see that both in the wave 2 response, we can also see that with regard to vaccines, right? In many ways, what we did was that unlike most other countries, and we can talk about how big an effect this has or doesn't have, but the fact of the matter is that a large part of our bookings, 62%, was going to come from a single source, which was Novavax. If you look at it from a manufacturing perspective, over 80% was going to come from a single manufacturer, which is SII, say Serum Institute of India, right? Whatever that is not de-risking yourself. So in many ways, the state in India, I think, is good at reacting, relatively good at reacting to uncertain situations, but not so great at risk management in general, as I saw from both wave 2 response as well as this one. The second big, I think, like gap, and this has been noted by many scholars as well, Devesh Kapoor and others, is that the Indian state is really good at doing tasks which have a clear goal and a clear exit. So for instance, running an election, ironically running a vaccination campaign, right? Things like that. These are things that the Indian state is relatively good at, where it's like there's a very clear goal, right? Do X, Y, Z by so and so time frame, and there's a clear exit, right? An election happens and then it ends. What the Indian state is relatively bad at is at solving chronic problems. So malnutrition, economic development, because then it's not like a clear projectizable goal where you say that do X by Y by doing these 3 steps, and then you exit, right? So the state machinery, and I would say it's the entire state machinery, is unable to kind of like gear itself up to be able to deal on chronic problems as opposed to acute problems which have a clear goal, clear path, and clear exit, right? And that I think the Indian state again has to get like better at, because a lot of problems that we need to solve across different development indices, not just health, are of that chronic nature. So what we have to do to be able to solve chronic problems is a broader issue. I think it's not just an issue of our institutions and hence our state, but also our intellectual ecosystem not being very well geared towards solving chronic problems. So we have what I call a lamppost problem, which is from the there's a folk tale of Nazruddin Hodja that is looking for the keys under the lamppost, though that's not very logical because that's where the light is, right? And in many ways, I think that is the pathology that plays out in our solving of acute problems. When an acute problem happens, then it is very visible. It is very clear. There is a media cycle, there is public outrage, there is all of that, and then that kind of ensures that there is sufficient attention to it. Chronic problems, on the other hand, don't have that kind of nature. There is no urgent, there is no headline today about how many people in India are malnourished, right? So it doesn't invoke the same kind of urgency. So our problem solving mechanisms as a state and as a society are not geared towards solving chronic problems as well. And that's a broader intellectual failure as well, and an ecosystem, intellectual ecosystem failure, and not just an institutional failure. And hence it will be like tougher for us to solve over time. So these, I think, are the two big things for the Indian state to grapple with, which is risk versus uncertainty and how to solve chronic versus acute problems.
So I believe we can go ahead very swiftly because I think the second aspect has been very interestingly discussed. So let's put up some perspective on the international media issue, and then we'll directly go to the courts. After that, we have a little few more topics to discuss. Now, I'll give some sort of a pretext because we should not discuss this in haywire. Now, if we watch the thread of Hindu history by Vishal Ganeshan, very interesting thread if you watch, we'll come to know that the behavior of the international media towards India and Indian people of whatever faith they are has not been very reasonable. In fact, from the 1857 war to the present times. Yet, regardless of that fact, that we know that the international media's responses towards India is quite weird. Like there was one time when in 1989, and I am taking a little bit out of context, but only for the sake of understanding the analogy which the international media operates. In 1989, I think before Narasimha Rao, what was the time was that they were actually trying to project India as some sort of a superpower, like India is trying to do with Quad and its own naval alliances and so forth. But that boom did not happen like that. The boom actually started with 2004, and then somehow under this current government, the Quad operationalized. And so what happens is that when perception is being made about things, and even India today did it, even many international media or magazines did it. I'm not naming anyone particularly, but that's the general trend. So taking into the context of what the international media is doing right now when it comes to the second wave, and I'm only talking about the second wave. I don't think we should cover the farm protest and all those old issues because the typical response and the trends are very similar. The trends here also are similar when it comes to the second wave, but there are some very interesting questions which people can ask. So let me put the questions, and then I would distribute the discussion accordingly. One of the questions which can be asked is, okay, let us say that the international media, let us say that the government has failed. All governments have failed, state, central, municipal, they have failed. They have their own particular levels and degrees of failures. How much should we trust the international media? Then it could also be asked that, okay, fine, if we say that the international media has some ounce of truth, are they actually trying to help in a sense, or they're actually becoming a force multiplier when it comes to doing what the national and the local media do, as we have seen the case. So how should we see it? Even in the elections case, it happens. Even in other situations, it happens. So I would believe that if Kiran would like to start, and then maybe we could have follow-ups. So, yeah.
Yeah, as an Indian living abroad, right, I do follow international media, but I do follow Indian media also to look at India, how Indians themselves are talking about the problems. And there is a huge gap, especially when you look at non-English media in India and discourse generally in society, because it's mostly not in English. There is a huge gap between what Indian problems are and what Indian current issues are, and how they are getting reported abroad. And Abhivardhan, as you pointed out, there is a huge history and legacy prejudice from colonialism, from settler colonies in the United States, from basically religious warfare in different societies and civilizations. And we have actually a baggage of tropes that they use to kind of reflect anything with respect to India. I have a good example, like there was a time in Hollywood movies when there was anything they were showing in India, they would show the Taj Mahal. So Armageddon movie from Bruce Willis or somebody, the asteroid is about to hit, and different countries are being shown. And then India was shown with the Taj Mahal, with people praying in front of the Taj Mahal. And I was like, what the hell is going on? And I think they showed the Taj Mahal also in the Slumdog Millionaire. It's just a trope, it's something that always comes. Similarly, there is cow. You always have to have something connected to the cow, and maybe some excrement. People bodies burning, and they're really disgusting and stupid. And at some level, it's extremely shallow. And we are naturally annoyed. Like Indians would, sometimes suddenly get jolted into this thing, saying, "What is this trope? What is it doing with us?" We don't have an institutional mechanism to kind of analyze these things in media, and then somehow, educate people also. Like, because, but the thing is that this is one issue, and I don't think it will go away. I mean, this is not with the COVID issue; it's just like a consistent thing. And there is another really huge gap for an economy of India's size, which is, Britain's economy size comparable to now, right? It's, I guess, in a few years, it would be like double that, something approaching $5 trillion or something, it would be the GDP of India. Now, what do we have as Indian economy, as a country, to kind of project our media abroad? Like, are we actually do we have anything comparable to the BBC with a comparable budget? We don't have any of that. We don't have actually any translations of Indian news articles in different world languages. We don't do that. We don't do the other way either. So we don't translate world news articles into Indian languages. So there is actually a cultivated gap between international media and Indian media. And it's fair to say that international media has some basic tropes where it is restricted to. And it is, irrespective of what happens, it will always have this problem, and we are not doing anything to fix it. So I hope at some point the Indian government would actually invest some money and some talent and institutional power. Like China has this Confucius Institutes, right? What do we have? Why don't we have Kalidas Institutes? We don't have any. It's essentially like that is a fundamental weakness that we have as India. Now, with respect to COVID or comparable crisis, when something serious is hitting, and information which is faulty or misinformation is actually like a fog of war. So people can be easily misinformed, and then bad information can spread like virus, essentially, and then that can result in deaths. That can result in in a chaotic situation that can result in like a terrorism or a civil war. So there is actually fundamental risks with media. And international media, because of this its own baggage with whatever tropes it uses, can be also used within India to affect Indian society. So that is actually the bigger risk. I'm not really worried so much about misrepresentation in global media about India, because that is something we have to live with, and we are not doing anything to solve it, and we have to be prepared for another couple of decades at least. But what I'm more worried about is misrepresentation and misinformation, especially like if there is a government mechanism for vaccination, and that is basically being misrepresented as they are actually poisoning people and killing them, some absurd shit like that. So that has tangible consequences in Indian society, and people will die because of these kinds of things. And yeah, this is where I am actually a bit more worried about, and sometimes I lose my sleep because of this media warfare, because we have very powerful social media things that we don't control in India, and Indians are dependent on them. So yeah, I would also like to have a little bit of discussion on this aspect, because we have seen how COVID is represented in the second COVID wave of India is represented in world media. Yeah, you can complain a little bit about racism, blah blah, but that is to be expected. Nothing surprising about it. What would be worrisome is if actually this thing triggers anything worse within Indian society, and there I am actually not very sure. I'm hopeful that it won't, but yeah, this is where I'm more worried about.
So if anybody wishes to, yes, Abhishek, please. Yeah.
See, I don't see international media playing any significant role in how the perception of Indians in India will be affected. I don't see that happening at all. I don't recall anyone. I don't think I've met anyone in the rural India, and India is still a dominantly rural country, which even know what time is or what economist is. In fact, most of the people I know, they think that whatever economists predict, it goes up. It goes exactly opposite. So it has no credibility even in the people who I generally talk to. It might be a good magazine, there might be good publications, but the problem with the Western media and international media is they do not run through ground reporters in India. They actually run through allies in Indian media. There are few usual suspects who are their go-to guys for everything. I know a person who has written on international law, who has written on the Indian cooking styles, as well as who has written on something as minor as the breed of Indian cows for an international media. One single person writing on all three. He's a seasonal expert. You go to see South, there is a newspaper, I think I'm not wrong, South China Morning Post or something, SCMP or something. You go and you will see Veer Singhvi writes on everything under the sun there. You ask what you want. I think they are commissioned. They just say, okay, we want to write something on idli and dosa. Tomorrow, Veer Singhvi will write something on it. You want him to write on, say, let's say Kargil War, he will write something on it. They commission it. They run through allies. They do not have ground reporters, and they actually go to usual suspects who have some international standing, misplaced, legitimate, that are not going to, and they run through them. There is no ground reporters as such. Firstly, secondly, of course, there is inherent racism, and there is nothing more much we can do about it other than what Kiran suggested. We need to invest, and I have been begging the government. I have written multiple letters on investment on two counts. One, we need to establish a media house. You need to have something, a centralized international channel. I don't want the government to run it. Do not want government to run it. I want an independent trust or something to run it. At least it should be India-based international channel. I'm not happy with Vion. Vion is a private enterprise. Do not have that much amount of money or capacity to move. We need to have something. Secondly, I want them to invest in institutes across world. We need to have our centers. What is happening right now is India establishing chairs, but is having absolutely no editorial control, absolutely no control over the appointment or the curriculum or the studies or the research that might be carried out there. I'm aware of, for instance, in Kyoto University, if I'm not wrong, there is an India Institute established by Government of India, and they have been researching on what? They have been researching on relationship of Indic culture to Africa, and it has absolutely nothing to do with India. It talks about how the Patels in Rwanda have been situated there and have been studying. It has absolutely nothing to do with what India is in India is. Why? Because the gentleman who is there, he is from some other part of the world. There are very few Indian professors in these Indian institutes, and who are professors? They have been Western educated or who have been educated in India, who has been desperate to go to West. There is absolutely no control over appointment. I want some. See, this is not some ideal world where you can say that okay, the government will fund, but it will not control. You have to go into real politics. You'll have to control the research. You'll have to control the editorial policies. You'll have to control the appointment policies. For hell yeah, boss, I have presented evidence in court through studies which have been commissioned by telecom majors, which say that these mobile towers are actually good. They do not harm anyone. We have studies that, yeah, of course, if we can have studies which say that mobile towers are good and everything, we can have studies favoring India as well. And there are multiple things which have gone right in last 7 years or last 10 years. I will not differentiate between government. There have been multiple things that have gone right, but we rarely get to see them. Rarely get to read them. I remember I had pitched an article for some Australian newspaper in 2017 regarding Swachh Bharat in UP. The moment Yogi government took over, they started this Swachh Bharat toilet scheme called Izzat Ghar. They started implementing it, and within 2 or 3, I think not even years, I think it was 2 3 months, we had commissioned 80 lakh toilets, 80. It was splendid. I keep going to villages around Lucknow, and I've seen every house, even if they have a toilet inside, he has made a toilet outside. And it's called Izzat Ghar. And it actually says the date on which it was commissioned, the amount which was given, to whom it was given, to whom it is allotted. Everything is mentioned. But nobody has covered that. Coming back to COVID, same thing happened. There are travel restrictions. They can't come to India, most of them. They rely on what is reported here. They have allies who have actually reported in a manner that is convenient to them. There were certain issues with the government. There were certain issues with the current dispensation. All of them have come to fore. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't think the government is also concerned with what is happening too much in international media. They know that at the end it will be the money and it will be the labor and it will be the actual what do you say, the economic conditions that will govern the flow of investment. And I don't think they need anything more than investment or tourism from abroad. They don't need the too much indulgence of the foreign powers. So I don't see the government being concerned about it in short term. In domestically, I don't think they will have international media will have absolutely any role whatsoever. That's it.
Great. So, any addition? Yes, Kiran, please.
I'd like to ask others if they have anything to add.
Yeah, just a couple of points to what both Kiran and Abhishek said. While I also largely agree that domestically there might not, like, of course, I think largely there won't be too many repercussions of the kind of reportage we've seen from foreign houses. I think the foreign reporting cannot completely be dissociated from what we are seeing being reported by domestic news channels also. I would rather treat it as a continuum and not mutually exclusive aspects. Because if you look at some of the reporting which happened around funeral pyres in April, in fact, like the genesis of that happened with domestic media houses, where that kind of predatory journalism started at some place and then it was picked up, and foreign media houses just flew with it. And so one person could probably do a camera shot or do a live streaming on Instagram if they are from India, while BBC or CNN would use drone shots and show the entire vista and go with it. So I feel some of that reporting is bleeding into each other. And when national media houses or a large number of digitally well connected sources are trying to follow a particular line, it is also coming down to the level of regional media. And I think that is where a lot of the damage could happen, because I've largely come to believe that it's not dissociated reporting, but a continuum between regional to international. And when it is shown that this is the kind of sensationalized clickbaity material which is working, why wouldn't a media house in, say, Odisha also try to show like one feature on funeral pyres and sort of present it that way? But again, it's not about like the dehumanizing aspect of a lot of that reporting which has happened. Even yesterday we saw it when we saw that thing about cow dung being used largely in clinical establishments in India, which came out of nowhere. It was one story in one village in one state of India, and that's become like such a huge thing, and lot of like international portals took it up and ran like a concerted campaign. So that kind of trope, like Kiran mentioned, and that sort of dehumanizing to show that finally these guys are where we wanted them to be. Because last year, if you remember, a lot of the reports were those awestruck reports about where are the dead bodies in India, why are people not dying in India. And it wasn't just India, it was even countries like South Africa, which had managed to arrest like the fatality rate, and it wasn't as significant. So there were BBC news items on why aren't people dying, what's this mystery. And suddenly when people started dying, we were like, wow, now they've started dying, and now we have to like show it as much as we can, because this is where we wanted them to be. So again, that's one entirely different discourse. But what this is doing is creating a very faulty kind of pop analysis which is happening around things which could influence and which definitely influences policy, like for instance fatality rates with regards to COVID. So the amount of focus that you had and reporters had on crematoriums, the way it was amplified in the international media, has now made it into expert circles. And that kind of anecdotal reportage is now being used as the most robust metric to determine how many people are dying in India. So nobody, like Abhishek mentioned, because these people don't really come to India, or I mean, they don't know India that well. They perhaps wouldn't even know that there are specific crematoriums allowed, like only specific crematoriums can cremate people who are who died because of COVID. Even then, people who are dying there, if they've just had a COVID test, or if they are suspected COVID patients, even then they go there. But would that mean that they are COVID casualties? They probably would not be aware that there is like a specific caste group in India which deals with funeral rites in a crematorium. So that is a limited group, and when there are COVID protocols which take a longer amount of time, a large amount of burden on certain crematoriums with a small group of people, it sort of adds to that burden. So this kind of in every single aspect, this kind of anecdotal reporting can be I mean, it can be kept aside. But what we are seeing is, instead of like it being used to say certain things about, say, how I understand that there is a need to show that shock value, to show people that, oh, don't be complacent, this is what's happening. But that sustained reporting that happens, and the way it has bled into expert circles, has now made it like a theater of the absurd, where you're using like these crematorium images and anecdotal stories of, I heard this from Bihar, and I heard this from UP, and my cousin's father told me this, and that is why there are 8x deaths happening. And the journalist asks them, oh, repeat it. And he says, 8x deaths are happening. And she's like, did you hear it? 8x deaths are happening. So she says, he says, and then it sort of becomes the truth. And ultimately, then it boils down and comes to the regional media. And then our families start consuming the same information. So I think the problem with this kind of reporting is, we are not in a situation where everything is absolutely, maybe the perception part is insulated, because we don't read Wall Street Journal, in Darbhanga, probably. But I think the minute it goes into the policy space, and you start using these reports to be actual strong indicators to determine policy, and then you try to keep repeating that information using like local foot soldiers inside the country, there is a possibility that it can go down to the level of actual, like, communities create a lot of unsubstantiated panic. And if you use these kind of guesstimates for designing policy, that policy is anyway not bound to succeed. So I think that's a huge problem we need to be careful of.
So yes, I think Akshay wishes to add something. Yeah.
I'll just make a small point, which is that essentially, to take Pratyasha's point on this being a continuum, I want to actually point out that some people who have dealt with this issue are actually doing a good job of holding the government accountable on the specific issue of underreporting of deaths and kind of bringing facts to light, such as the Gujarat newspapers, which actually went and did the whole analysis of death certificates versus death certificates issued versus COVID deaths reported, so excess deaths and so on, to be able to like come to this thing. Now, any such analysis won't be perfect, but it's good data. It's good, credible data to be able to come to a determination, which then sheds some light. And if that then, I mean, is analyzed and then becomes an input to policy, I actually think it will be quite healthy, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that to achieve the same objective, which is, hey, let's get to, in an information scarce environment where there could be underreporting, not necessarily due to fudging, but there is underreporting. Let's say it's because of like process errors, this thing, and maybe there is fudging as well, right? But whatever be the reason, let's say that's the situation today. And as a journalist, then you feel it incumbent upon you, which is, and it is right, that your responsibility then is to bring that fact to light. I think the kind of work purely on in terms of journalistic quality and hence its impact on public discourse and then later on public policy, that kind of work which actually goes and methodically documents what is happening, collecting hard data, putting that there, as opposed to the stated intent of actually showing those funeral pyres and all that, which was actually to create the same impulse, which is to say, hey, you know what? I mean, the government is saying only so many people are dead, but look at this drone shot of these funeral pyres, so it's clearly more. I actually don't know whether the latter really achieves that purpose in any case, because like are people going to sit and count the funeral pyres and comparing it with something else and then coming up with this? So I actually see the latter, even if I give the benefit of the doubt, saying that the people are doing it with the best of intentions, which I don't think is the case, because there is a baggage that we have to contend with of years of how the West views India, the common tropes about India, and certainly, I mean, stories like this cow dung being used for this thing and all that, I mean, fit into like a broader and lazy mental framework being applied to India. But even if I say that no, that's not the case, let me give the benefit of the doubt, and this is all purely with a public spirited intent of A, wanting to underreport deaths, or rather expose the underreporting of deaths, and B, kind of like alerting people to like poor treatments such as cow dung. Let's say that I take it at face value, that's what you want to do. I think the far better way journalistically to be able to do that is what the Gujarat local newspapers actually did, which is to go and collect hard data on deaths that are overreported, then apply some methodology to it to try and figure out like what that means, right? And that gives enough data into the public domain also for others to be able to weigh in and say, okay, if this is a sample, then how do you extrapolate it, and so on and so forth, right? So that I think is good journalistic work, supposedly in the same direction to address the same purpose, but I think doing it far better, even if I give all of these the benefit of the doubt.
I would like to add a point. I think, there is a point which we have to see, especially when it is about international reporting about India. Yeah, I don't know who mentioned it. Pratyasha mentioned it probably, or Abhishek, that the Indian government probably cares only about investment into India and tourism probably, but not necessarily about other tropes that are being held here. But actually, they affect the investment. So India currently, right now, for example, is trying to take advantage of the whatever inconveniences and whatever problems are present between China and the West, especially the United States, and redirect some of the manufacturing into India. It was getting, the work was started like a couple of years ago. India didn't do a great job, but hopefully there would be some manufacturing that will be redirected into India. There is interest. There is a serious amount of interest in the West to kind of reduce the risk, distribute the risk, also have some manufacturing in other countries. And India is a rising up competition for this thing. Now there is actually an interesting phenomenon happening. This is not just restricted to the rehashing of the tropes, but they're just being used. They are just being used, and this is especially clear when you look at Chinese media on India. There was actually like a few weeks ago, there was a very ridiculous cartoon in Chinese media. China, I think, made some kind of a rocket which was about to launch and take off. And they made like a contrast saying China is launching rockets and they're going up, and on the right side is funeral pyres on India. Now, why is that? It's like a really absurd, irrelevant comparison, isn't it? But it makes a very strong statement about what China wants to say, which is that you cannot redirect manufacturing out of China. China is an efficient, scientifically based, technologically driven economy, and India doesn't have any clue, and it is essentially self-inflicted torture of its own citizens and chaos. So that is the kind of image that is trying to be projected. So if you have these tropes being rehashed on influential areas like Economist or some other magazines where people who would like to invest would read, that would have an effect. So it is not a zero sum, like there is no it's not a zero cost thing. The Indian state and Indian government actually have serious costs for it. The Indian economy, like people who are trying to do trade, big production houses with other countries, they would actually face loss. It's like a tangible loss, several millions, or I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars of loss. So the thing is, if that is the case, why is India not investing in kind of countering that? So an economy of the size of India, it's absurd that we don't have something like the BBC. And we have the talent. We have a lot of people who are actually very fluent in English, who have subject expertise, and who can do data collection or reporting or whatever. And essentially, we are so many people in India that we can actually be a very strong power media wise in the world. So why is the Indian government not investing it? And why is the Indian economy, like the big production houses, actually ignoring this aspect? Because they are actually suffering losses. So it's like really clearly visible in the last few months. So people are, reacted to this cartoon from China, that rocket apparently crashed later. Anyway, they just reacted as some kind of anger and annoyed, but actually they don't see the underlying subtle messaging behind it, and that is the thing that is happening, and we have to be a bit watchful of it, I guess. And I don't know when when the government takes the logical step of actually creating institutions and media houses that are actually strong enough to project an economy of size of a billion, several trillion dollars. It's just absurd that we don't have it.
Akshay, you want to say something or?
Yeah, I actually want to disagree with Kiran.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. So while I'm fine with both government and civil society, for that matter, seeking to reshape narratives, counter narratives in the West and all that, I also don't want to overplay the importance of that on any hard policy measures for this one. Firstly, because I don't think either private sector or governments anywhere base any major policy decisions on such narratives or imagery or anything of that sort, right? I can say with some high degree of confidence that that's certainly not how private sector investment will look at things at all, right? They won't care. They won't care about whether there's like an image and time about funeral pyres. If the economy is doing well, then they will invest. It's simple and hard metrics like that, which determine all these things. And I mean, even on something like defense or this thing and all that. See, the pathology that could lead to that, the underlying issue can be a problem. So, for instance, if they think that the Indian state is fundamentally like not getting its act together, and hence is it like a good counterweight to China, that's a different issue, right? But not basis this imagery alone. That won't, I mean, like determine or change any minds or shape anything. It will never even enter into any conversation, into any major decision making, to my mind. I'm very confident about that on the economic space, and I'm fairly confident that that will translate even to the foreign policy and defense and other spaces as well.
See, I will agree with what Akshay has said. There is no evidence that all this reporting has affected us at all. Last year, there was a crazy reports in Economist and Time and everything, and last year we received crazy investments. I've been working with UP government on this, and the amount of interest and the amount of investments we have received in last year has been just breathtaking, astonishing. There is no other word for it, and I don't see any evidence that the farmers' protest or the CA protest or the riots or even the current COVID waves or have dampened the interest of the investors in India. The worst query I've received was from a South Korean vendor who asked me that is it safe to come to India because people are dying on streets. I told him that is not the case. He has been misled, and this was during first wave, not the second wave. I responded to him. He said, okay, this is what we were told and all, but he came. So I think they do not want to suffer their money because they have some perception or a cartoon is there. I don't see that is happening. But I will also, I actually wanted to respond earlier to Pratyasha. I don't think there is a trickle down effect of international media to regional media. I think it's the other way around. The first news of the funeral pyres came from Lucknow when Brijesh Mishra of Bharat Samachar decided to click a picture of the funeral pyres at 7:30 in the evening and showed it, saying that see the amount of cremations that are taking place. Interestingly, there was no COVID burning that was happening after 5:30. All the bodies which were there were kept waiting since morning. They were non-COVID bodies and they were burnt together. And he used this photo. Similarly, the cow dung story came first through Bharat Samachar of Uttar Pradesh of Brijesh Mishra, and then it was picked up by anyone else. That gentleman was denied a Rajya Sabha ticket by BJP. So he has been taking it out on. He is very close to SP. SP has funded it. It's open news. He goes around inaugurating hospitals of Samajwadi Party leaders and their daughters. So that gentleman started this. All these newses, funeral pyres aa gaya aapka. You take example of the cow dung story. You take example of the Gaumutra story. In fact, he was also a part. There was a news report. I'm not certain, so I don't want to say it on live TV. But I think there was a news report in which he asked a question whether there are cow remains in the vaccine and all. He also asked this on live TV, if I'm not wrong. I'm not certain. I've not seen that. Somebody told me, so I'm not very certain when I say that. But that gentleman has been very peculiar about these stories. And I have seen that first he brings it from in regional media and then it goes above. The first story about the bodies in Ganga, that also came from his home district. He comes from Unnao. It started from Unnao on his channel. He went to Gazipur, he went to Buxar. So he is aware that these bodies float almost every year. Whenever there is a pandemic, whenever there is some seasonal flu or something, these flow, and at times randomly they flow. I have stayed in Varanasi for 8 years, and I know these things happen. There used to be body which would flow in Varanasi as well. So this has happened for quite long. But to make news out of this and then sell it to foreign media, I think this is a bottom-up approach rather than a trickle-down effect. That's my perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I agree that the genesis of the news is local. And when I said funeral pyres, it started from India. And I meant Varkada because that's where I was largely seeing this kind of reporting, like perched in front of strategically placed wood and, showing, look at how I'm doing this coverage. And then it sort of started picking up from there. What I meant was that once there is a buzz created in the international media, there is again another sort of trickle down which happens, and that also happens in the realm of policy. So either way, I mean, it is a continuum either way, and it's very unmissable. In terms of repercussions, like you said, I mean, I would tend to agree with you, because we don't really have any evidence. But when it goes into the policy space, at least, and if it is informing policy design in the wrong way, sooner than later, we will see some kind of repercussions come.
I would like to just add a comment. I would be very happy if what Akshay said is correct, and I hope so. But there is definitely an impact. I'm, an academic, and I have this story from 2014, I think, when there was this horrible rape in Delhi, right? So, woman died, and there were massive protests, Nirbhaya protests in Delhi, and it was like all over the news here in Europe. And there was also specifically some news that there was an Indian student who wanted to, I think, do a research project, or maybe he was applying for a fellowship in some research lab in Germany. And then the professor replied to him saying that, we don't want to have any rapists in the lab. So we have, we have a community of women researchers, and we don't want to have anybody like this. So this was actually out somehow. The guy got annoyed and posted it, I guess, and it was created some ruckus, and this woman had to apologize and whatever. But there is, ignorance in people, even people who should know better, who are professors and so on. And if that is the case at that level, I would expect it would be similar also at any other person who, how many would know inside out a country, like foreign country like India, may not have been there, and it's essentially they would be making some decisions, maybe subconsciously, and it would translate into some kind of an opportunity cost. And I would be surprised if that really doesn't happen. Maybe people who already are in good contact, they already have some investments in India, or they might have some things already going on. Maybe they will not be affected. But people who are neutral, or who might be considering to do some activity, may get affected. And this is actually, even if the risk is minimal, I think the Indian government and the Indian economy should take it as a finite amount of cost, and need to protect and defend against it. I don't know how successful, but I think it's actually worth trying. Yeah.
No, I think countering narratives is important. I'm just trying to separate out the potential effects of that, and I just think that in more skin in the game professions uh, like people who have money at stake, or defense interests at stake, and stuff like that, that they rarely will go by such sketchy narratives to be able to take their decisions. That's all I'm saying. So that's what I'm distinguishing between this one. But yeah, I mean, but the broader point, I think, from an actionable perspective, I would agree with you, Kiran, which is that some systematic effort to build a counter narrative, I think, is important, not just by government. I think, like, even more broadly, society. I think just building the awareness about what those common tropes are, right, and what their history is, and handles like Hindu history do a good job of kind of like outlining that, right, that it doesn't come from a place of neutrality or something. It actually comes from, there's a legacy that many in the West have inherited, and certain frameworks and mental models of how they look at India that informs a lot of how which stories they choose to pick up and highlight, right. Just building awareness of that even among civil society, I think, is important. But for the large part, I think, while I think it is important and it is actionable and it is something that should be done both by government and by civil society, I just don't think that it has as much of an effect on these like very important aspects of things like investment, defense, foreign policy, things like that. That's the distinction I'm trying.
Great. So I believe we have a few issues left, but I think we are quite running out of time. So what can we do is that we can choose one of them, and then maybe we can go for uh, conclusions accordingly. So the one issue which I believe we should generally discuss out of consideration that it is an institutional problem is the great judiciary when it comes to
Yeah.
courts and their involvement. Now I will make a pretext for you, all of you means, and in a very simple manner. What I generally understand is that the way courts behave in India is like they are quite not clear with the Westminster system of government, and sometimes they also may be confused with what they are actually trying to do. They are trying to manipulate the ratio, or they are just trying to, I don't know, micromanage the development of the obiter in their judgments. And sometimes also it could be the case that they are actually trying to create their own form of technocracy. I don't know, copying from Americans or copying from somebody else. We actually see this trend everywhere, and it it seems quite ridiculous and seems quite funny to me. But I think this is a serious problem because even the executives of various levels are complicit to it, whether we agree to it or not. So Abhishek, you can give your holiest of insights, and then let's have follow up on this.
Yeah, I will begin by saying that there is no contempt or there is no disrespect that is meant to the honorable.
Yes.
Also, whatever I'm saying, it's the collective opinion of all five of us. So if anybody
Yes.
goes, again, all five of us go together.
Yes.
But yeah, see, I think you give too much benefit of doubt to the judiciary. They are not confused. It's not like they don't understand the principles, the Westminster principles. It's just about surely power. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's about power. They have got the power, they want to use it. Nobody would like to give up their power. They have the opportunities, except Justice R.C. Lahoti. I don't know of any judge who has actively refused to go into executive's domain. Everybody wants power. There has been a concerted effort by judiciary to take step by step, go into the policy making, decision making, and actually micromanaging everything. I remember there was a judgment by Delhi High Court during Uttarakhand floods when a Delhi uh, family's, I think, cousin made an application saying that my family is stuck in Uttarakhand, they have to be rescued, and they are asking them to go through a bridge that was made by army, but they are not comfortable going through it. The Delhi High Court passed a order saying that they have to be airlifted. Now imagine that being in a flood when there are no places to land helicopters. Delhi High Court orders that someone from Delhi who is in Uttarakhand has to be airlifted and directed certain Union of India to take steps to this regard. Made Ministry of Defense a party. It was set aside. The government refused to follow it. I remember the person who was actually handling on ground was one of my known, and he was an army officer, and he tells me, I just saw the order and I laughed. I didn't know what to do, and I just refused, and the SP actually had to serve the order, and he said that this is the order. He said, okay, just keep the order, ask the family to wait for 3 days. Very nicely they got onto that bridge and crossed. But it's crazy the amount of micromanaging that has happened in Delhi right now, specifically, and the statements that have been made by Uttar Pradesh High Court saying that it's a genocide that the oxygen is not being made available, or for that fact that we are left with the mercy of God, there is no government. All these steps, all these statements that have been made, they have only added to chaos. The Uttar Pradesh High Court actually went ahead and imposed a lockdown in certain cities. It said that you are directed to lock down certain cities, which was absurd. People did not know what to do at that time. Madras High Court went ahead and called the Election Commission a murderer. Bombay High Court went ahead and decided to discuss remdesivir and some other medicine I can't pronounce, whether it's an alternative or not. But the worst is the behavior of the feudal lords who sit in Delhi. What has actually happened that they are not governed by consideration that should actually govern them, that is justice and having a check on the executive. They have decided to go ahead and micromanage, and they are governed by the principles of self-preservation. What happened in the oxygen allotment case of Delhi was shameful, was disgraceful, and there is no other word for it, but it was selfish. They wanted not uh, all possible resources, they wanted all the resources at their domain. In fact, day before yesterday, during a hearing, Delhi High Court remarked that as long as Imran Hussain, the Aam Aadmi Party MLA, is getting the oxygen from Haryana, it's okay. As long as it's not from the allocated supply of Delhi, we are okay. If it doesn't matter, let them do whatever they want. That actually implies that you're fine with a citizen of Delhi stealing oxygen from the allocated supply of other states, bringing it to Delhi, and the High Court is fine with it because, oh, we have a territorial jurisdiction. States must compete. I do not deny that in cooperative federalism, states must compete, but courts can't. Courts shouldn't compete. Courts have to think beyond that. And then I'll give you an example. There was so much urgency in the oxygen matter. Court heard it for 3 days. Rajasthan filed a petition on, I think, 29th. Supreme Court didn't have the time to hear it till now. Why? Because Supreme Court is not located in Rajasthan, maybe. West Bengal has filed a petition in, I think, 2nd of May, or sorry, 3rd of May. They have not had the time to hear it now because maybe Supreme Court does not have a regional bench in Calcutta. So they are guided by self-preservation. It's judicial activism at its worst, judicial overreach, and it's a naked display of power, and they are out to grab it. I don't know how. I think anyone can tell the judiciary to stop. It's Tushar Mehta and no one else. He's a bulldozer. He has to bulldoze the judiciary. But even if government takes a hard stand, I don't see this situation changing anytime soon. Judiciary is going to encroach. It's going to exercise its power in the manner unbecoming of it. And yeah, I don't see it changing anytime soon. There is nepotism. There is a lot of ill in the judiciary. Also in the bar, it's has become something that it should not have. There is no transparency in the behavior of judiciary. There is no transparency in the behavior of bar councils, which are run in the country. The colleges are coming up like crazy with permission of bar council. There is a money-making scheme that is going on. But everything is just consumed by that bar is the court is the conscious keeper of the nation. It isn't. It should not act like one. It has to just do one thing: solve disputes. It's not there to actually govern or micromanage. Yeah, this was an absurd display. There is nothing else one can call it. Yeah. And I will repeat that this was a statement given to me by Abhivardhan, Akshay, and Kiran, and all of us are equally responsible for whatever I've said. Please proceed.
Yes. So, please, sir.
One thing I wanted to just add, I think over the years, I mean, everyone has seen that the problem of judicial overreach is a very old one. Rather amusing thread which helps you see that is that by there's a handle on Twitter called Ravikiran Rao. You should follow him and see he has a running thread on the different roles that the Supreme Court of India plays, right? From a police station to cricket selection board to this thing, and with links to all that. So I think this problem of the Supreme Court of India, or courts in general, the judiciary in India, I would say more broadly, kind of like assuming different roles and kind of delivering their views on that, I think is well known. What I think is somewhat noteworthy about the latest set of instances, which is even more alarming or worrisome to me, is that the abdication of the government of India to not just accept, but actually pass on some of that responsibility voluntarily to the court, right? So to kind of use I mean, it's almost like the government has agreed that yes, this is your legitimate role, and I actually don't think I should be doing some of the things that I ought to be doing. So I'm going to ask you to do this, right? So one could see that even this whole expert committee that was supposed to be constituted to solve the oxygen problem, which the Supreme Court constituted. Now one can call that overreach, and it is overreach, but it's an overreach on the basis of a prayer by the government of India itself. Government of India actually in its petition has asked for the Supreme Court of India to constitute that committee. It has done that, right? Now, so it is almost like a ceding of power, an abdication of power by the government to the court, and asking the court to solve problems which are knotty, which are tough, which may be politically difficult, and so on, and kind of using the court as a cover to be able to do that and take those decisions, and then say that, hey, our hand is kind of like forced anyway. That is what worries me, because at the end of the day, I mean, government of India is what we as citizens can hold accountable, right? We want, let's say, I mean, there has to be a committee for medical supplies, including oxygen. It has to be constituted by government of India. Their formula has to be published by government of India. And then if that is politically difficult for government of India, then they have to bear the political costs of that, right? But we should be able to hold them accountable for that. Using the court for this, I think, is not only bad in terms of overreach of the judiciary, but it progressively will even more erode the legitimacy of the judiciary, because it will be seen as a handmaiden of the executive, not just a substitute for it, which was bad enough, but an active handmaiden who's actually like helping shield the government from tough decisions. And I think that is what worries me most about the latest set of episodes.
I have another aspect to this whole problem. I think the judiciary overreaching actually is making the government essentially less efficient. And that is because what can be done according to a standard chain of command with certain resources, with certain deadlines, with time, money, whatever, right? They have to be met. The courts don't think about these things. They are not supposed to think about these things. They think more in terms of the fundamentals and principles, whether certain things are being respected and everything is being tallied. So in retrospect, something to cross-examine it is great. But when we have a real-time problem, when we have some situation which urgently needs an address to be addressed, the courts are not the right mechanism for doing that. The way of thinking in a court and arguing is not the right mechanism to solve a problem. This is why courts are not supposed to go and defend the country. That would just be the stupidest thing. Like when we have war, the courts cannot go and micromanage everything, right? So similarly, for any real-time problem, we need somebody who can actually take the constraints into account. And what I feel is that the courts are not being held accountable for the kind of opportunity cost they are bringing to the economy, to health, or whatever. They just they're not liable for that. They don't have any skin in the game, essentially. So they can say that, okay, let's ban this, let's ban that. Now, let's say because of this ban, let's say some people lost their livelihood, several billions of dollars of loss for whatever cities, or maybe people died. Who is accountable for that? Nobody is like cross-examining it and afterwards, right? So essentially, we are a democracy, and we should let the government do these things, and the government should bear the political costs for it, and it should be efficient in time to react to certain situation. So it is actually like we already have a pretty pathetic state institution inherited by the colonial legacy. And we have fundamental weaknesses with our institutions, how we are able to produce any kind of service to the citizens. Now, making it much worse by bringing in the courts who are already overloaded and who are actually like having a gigantic judicial backlog. Now, why are they here? Actually, this is just like we are already having a trouble with our efficiency in our executive, and they are making it worse. So I feel that this is actually like making the state even weaker, which is probably not what the courts want, right? I mean, even if they want just the self-protection, self-preservation, these kinds of things, they cannot just make, they just cannot entangle everything and just nothing can run, essentially, right? So I think at some point, I hope that we will have like some kind of a common sense somehow dawning on everybody, and then they will have to just realize that, yeah, certain things are not on the responsibility of the judiciary. It should not be. I don't know where that thing should be done. I think we need to probably have some principle saying that anything that is real time should not be our responsibility. That's how the court should probably say. Real time being with time resource constraints. I'm speaking as a computer scientist. We have real time process management, and real time means anything which is a strong constraints. So I think courts are probably not meant for that, and they should probably just accept it.
Great. So, sure, please. Yeah.
Just one thing. I think the fact about courts not defending in the war, I think wars. I think you spoke too soon. We might just see that happening. We don't know. Vivardhan, please.
Sure, thank you. Well, so Pratyasha, if you would like to add something, up to you, or if
No, I think I'm good. I'll stay out of the contempt.
Yeah, it's a collective responsibility yet.
Sure. So let's go ahead with the concluding part. So I think one thing for the honorable courts, we can say is that it also kinds of blurs the accountability. So, for example, okay, fine, a judge is saying we'll do this, a bench, full bench or constitutional bench is saying we'll do this, or maybe a division bench is saying we'll do this or whatever. What happens is that I think even that happens with the media also, because of the kind of reporting which happens. I think, and again, I may be wrong, I just see these instances and I see this similarity in both the cases, since we have been discussing the media and the judiciary and obviously the government. What happens is that the scheme of accountability which should go to the executive, which should rightfully go, that is what we call as democracy, doesn't happen properly. And then what happens is that we feel, okay, fine, this is our messiah or they are our messiah, and then I think this is just a goal posting process. I think this happens in India. We have discussed this. So let's see how this goes. I think I would agree with Abhishek that this trend will grow only vicariously. So let's see. Anyways, so I think we are nearing the end of this discussion. So I would like to ask everybody to give their concluding remarks. I'll request everyone to go in a clockwise manner. So let's start with Akshay, then Abhishek, then Kiran, then Pratyasha. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think one, in terms of concluding the overall discussion, I think we were talking largely about wave 2, the response of the government and other institutions, as well as the response of other stakeholders such as media and so on, right? I think overall, I mean, if one had to summarize across both wave 2 and vaccination program, which not directly, it won't avert wave 2, but should certainly help us with wave 3. I would say collectively, I mean, we are in a very bad shape on both fronts, right? The response to wave 2 has been poor by government. The response to the way vaccination has been set up has also been poor. And the input from stakeholders, I mean, to the extent that they have been accepted, have made the problem worse. I mean, vaccination being a classic example, right? Where the shift in policy, to my mind, I mean, was worse, which is the shift to federalism, shift to freer markets and so on, than the policy that we had earlier, right? So in some ways, I mean, what disappoints me about wave 2 and vaccination overall is that not only did government get it wrong, but the problem solving mechanisms that we have as a society and corrective mechanisms that we have as a society are not working well to get us back to the right direction, right? And that's what worries me overall. And I think that requires a deeper reflection on at different levels, starting from how we improve state institutions in general, right? Of course, and in the immediate term, I mean, how we hold government itself accountable and get better governance with with the amount of state capacity that we have, right? And advocate for policies that will help the situation that we are in today. That's like the most near term thing. But the broader term thing, I think, is how we reimagine our state institutions, whether our government, the union versus states, the judiciary, and so on. How we reform that, how we improve that to be able to deal with crises better, anticipate them better. And this is across the board. This is not just health, but even across the board. I think we'll need to have a far more resilient state institutions, but also as a society, then how we build the right intellectual ecosystem to be able to problem solve better, right? Because I think this, what we've seen over the last couple of months, to my mind, represents all these failures. It represents a governance failure, a larger state failure, but also an intellectual failure, which is the whole policy and intellectual ecosystem not rising to the task. And I think each of these has to be addressed as we think about how to go forward after COVID.
Yes, Abhishek. Yeah.
See, I agree with Akshay. I don't think I have anything substantial to add other than it's a collective failure. Everybody added to the chaos. Nobody tried to actually solve it. Everybody wanted to disown the mess, and everybody wanted to be seen that they're doing something when effectively doing nothing and adding to the chaos. Judiciary made a mess. Executive was not up to the task. Politicians created a confusion. Media created panic. There is nobody can be absolved of this. And of course, as Akshay mentioned, I'll not refer to myself as an intellectual, but in the intellectual class actually failed in actually coercing the government into doing the right thing. The government was coerced by politicians to do, for instance, the vaccine policy. It is a terrible vaccine policy. There should have been opposition. There should have been some resilience, some resistance to that. But there was nothing. Everybody was like, oh, theek hai, states ko de do, federalism hai and everything. And nobody actually opposed. People were either defending the earlier policy or they were supporting the next policy. Nobody was saying that, ki, boss, why this policy is correct, that these are the problems that will occur, that is, these are the problems that will happen. And yeah, I'm not that hopeful. I don't think we'll learn from our failures that much. I'm working with bureaucracy. There is absolutely no remorse, no learning experience for them. I think people will forget easily. We'll have a good vaccination run August onwards or July onwards, and people will forget these things. Our infrastructure, we will not focus on long-term infrastructure. Thankfully, UP had planned for long-term infrastructure. Most of them, it will be operational in 2022. They have made 21 new hospitals in last 3 years, big hospitals. But I don't see the specific measures which are taken for COVID panning out in long term. This will be short-term infrastructure. Most of the infrastructure was destroyed in January. Again, it will be dismantled and destroyed. I am not that hopeful that we'll learn from this, but of course, there might be learning in terms of data collection, data tabulation, and might be learning in terms of how to actually dispense data. But other than that, on governance level, I'm not very hopeful that things will change. Yeah. Pratisha. Sorry, Kiran.
Should I? Sorry.
Okay, I will go then. So I will just add like what would be the ideal solution from my point of view to kind of fix these issues. Number one, the central government should take full responsibility of this. It doesn't make any sense to delegate responsibility in a pandemic. They should take full responsibility for the implementation and failures for whatever they have. So vaccination should be central government run. And in my point of view, it is so trivial as an expense. It should be provided for free for everybody, but on a prioritized queue. So people have to be vaccinated according to the ages. It should not be open to everybody. It should be available only after an appointment on an app or something like that. It should not be only at the later stages. It would be like that. So it should be run according to a standard project, what that would happen. And so that would be the vaccination. And similarly, any response to hospitals and situations, it should be done by the central government. Then the capacity, like what we have as the health infrastructure, is really, really under serving the citizens. We really have very low number of doctors per the population, nurses per population, hospitals per population. So why not put more money into this, and significant amount of money, and also training. We need training of doctors and nurses, and I would say train them in Indian languages. They cannot probably speak in English, all of them. So we should just get like a massive manpower to train. So this would probably help us prepare the infrastructure for the coming big crisis, whichever it is. Then about the government and the responsibilities, I would say the ideal situation would be an executive which knows what it is doing. That basically means not jack of all trades, not generalists alone. They should be experts in epidemiology, experts in data processing, experts in large scale population studies, and so on. And these experts need to be, maybe PhDs, or at least professionals in these areas, have to be hired, and they should be given the job of secretaries of who is running this thing. And we need to be competitive. People who really are bright should aim to go there. Like whoever is working in ICMR or some things like that, they should be moving forward into dealing with such situations. So it's not just related to health. We have a fundamental problem because of our colonial legacy. IAS people who are just randomly, were shifted from one department to the other. They don't know anything about the discipline. And similarly, I don't want to, have another co judiciary, but they should also, bring in expertise, and they should limit themselves to legal issues and not poke in areas where they don't necessarily have the expertise. So we need to have a standard mechanism of cultivating expertise and putting them in with the right type of institutions. So it will take time, but I hope that we will be prepared for the next big crisis, because it will definitely come. It is not like an if, it's just about when. And we should be, as a state and as a country, we should be able to withstand such crisis. So if we have fundamental weaknesses in our institutions, I think those are the most serious issues. Governance failures we have discussed, and they have been there. They have to be owned up. But these are from my point of view, it's less of the issue. We should be more concerned about really making our institutions stronger. Yeah. So that's probably my my comments on this, and I hope that we will soon get out of this scenario and able to take stock of what we did wrong and what we did correct, and actually not forget the lessons what we have learned in the last 1 year here.
Yes, Pratyasha, please go ahead.
So to sum up, I feel it's always easier to be smart in hindsight and sort of understand what all has gone wrong. So I understand that a lot of criticism coming from public wisdom at this point is based on hindsight, because complacency, though we are blaming the political class for it, was pretty much everywhere. And even though in our personal lives we may have been a little more careful, largely the country as a whole had very significantly dampened risk perception during certain months, and we all are collectively paying the price for it. So keeping that wisdom of hindsight aside, I think it's very, very important to acknowledge that irrespective of the amount of preparation that could have gone in, had this complacency not been there, the health infrastructure of India would never, even with all preparation being done, it would have never been able to absorb the kind of damage that this wave has brought in with it. Because this is not just 1 year or 7 years of lack of focus on health, and particularly primary health. This has been decades of lack of focus on primary health. So what has happened in this wave is that the middle class, which could probably throw money at problems and solve it, has not been able to do that. So it is just that salience of that problem that is hitting us hard, because we never had to face these problems, and these problems were not in our vicinity. So when we talk about maternal mortality, or women not being able to access hospitals even for a delivery, or losing out on a lot of money
to go for their annual, monthly ANC visits, those don't register to us because those are spread out over time. But because everything is happening at one go, and it's happening in proximity to us, and it's happening in Delhi, and in other like big cities, at least at the moment, it's becoming extremely relevant to us. So I think the lesson from this is to look at the health infrastructure in India and to understand why. I mean, irrespective of the amount of attention that this government is trying to give to tertiary care, to drill in the fact that without focusing on primary health care, you will never be able to build in that culture of preventive health care, which is missing in India, because we just don't have the means to think around preventive, and even in terms of curative care, we are crumbling. So unless that is done, a lot of these problems cannot be solved. And a major part of it, when we talk of infrastructure, we always talk of buildings and ventilators and beds and oxygen cylinders. It has to be about skilled personnel coming into the workforce, because without that, nothing is going to get resolved. So there are ventilators lying in district headquarters without skilled people to operate them. So till we have the adequate number of frontline workers, well paid frontline workers, so there are ASHA workers who are probably leading from the forefront, who are para workers and not even paid properly. And we don't want to talk about that, because it's probably like easier to say that the government has been complacent and all of that. But there are very strong structural problems, chronic problems, like Akshay talked about, in the health sector, which haven't been discussed, and this time it is all out on the open and extremely relevant to us and extremely salient to us. So hopefully our focus on primary healthcare after this increases manifold. Hopefully we try to address the chronic shortage of skilled personnel in the healthcare space, and we try to understand that without looking at health in a concurrent sort of setting, we institutionally we won't have the bandwidth to deal with future problems. May not be of the same magnitude, but even if it's smaller, we won't have the bandwidth to deal with it. So it's the right time for the state to and the government to double down on the healthcare sector, and maybe make some permanent changes, try to tackle those chronic problems. And hopefully, just to wind up, I hope all of us continue staying safe, and look at our mental health and physical health. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you so much, Pratyasha. So, thank you so much to all, actually. And we come to the concluding part. I think we are a bit late from the 120-minute timeline, but it's fine. I mean, 18 minutes is not a big deal. So, we come to the end of this episode of Investing Season 1. We hope to have more discussions on this issue and other Indic issues and other Indian issues. So maybe we would be having any of the panelists back again, maybe in future episodes. So let us see. So I thank everyone who has been watching this for 2 hours and so forth. I would thank Akshay, I would thank Abhishek, Kiran, and Pratyasha for joining for this session. And that's it. So please follow Internationalism Global Podcast on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel. Please follow us on LinkedIn. Please follow us on Twitter. Please follow us everywhere. We will be coming up with amazing episodes, not just in this thing, but also on AI, also on international affairs. Much is going to come in the coming months. So let's get on to it. Thank you so much.